I want to welcome all the chatters and viewers, and also would like to welcome any of the channels that are mirroring us tonight. Thank you very much for your participation and your support.
I want to introduce our guests tonight. I'm really honored and privileged to have these gentlemen here. On the left of your screen, you will see Mr. John Zangus. He's with Occupy DC. He helped us to coordinate this interview with the gentleman on my right, which is Mr. Start Loving, who is an activist, and we're actually broadcasting live outside of the Canadian Embassy in Washington, D.C., and I want to say thanks to our friend Organizer X. Keith is on the scene to help out with tech problems on that side. He's off the screen, but he is nearby, so thank him for coming over there and giving us a hand. So, gentlemen, welcome. It's an honor and a privilege to be able to speak with you both tonight, and we've all been looking forward to it. I'm going to start off really quick with a little introduction to John. And John Zangus is with Occupy DC. He's very active in the movement there. And I just want to give a little bit of questions about what brought you to the Occupy movement, and what is your role with Mr. Loving there, John?
Well, I was first brought to the Occupy movement when I noticed young folks staying at the park. They had several people had camped out, and I asked them what they were doing. They told me that they were related to Occupy Wall Street and that they were protesting economic conditions, social issues around the country. And I stayed with Occupy DC for 7 months, and I've known Mr. Loving for about 5 years and helped him on and off with some of his materials for his protests or his vigils. And in so doing, I learned about his strike regarding hunger, regarding CO2 and emissions of the earth, and I became very involved in that with him.
Okay. And you touched on the original connection with Occupy DC, and it's my understanding in our conversations earlier that some of the Occupy DC focus has shifted from originally economic issues to now more environmental and ecological issues. You want to speak to that just a bit?
Yes. Primarily Occupy was concerned with social and economic issues. However, in our particular location in Washington, D.C., we're now shifting towards more of the ecological issues, and we found that the most serious threat that's impacting us is global warming, and many of the activists have actually become involved in this strike, this hunger strike, this vigil.
Okay. And just quickly, I'd be interested in knowing what you personally have learned as part of Occupy.
Quickly, I can't even begin to tell you the number of things that I've learned. There are so many. I've learned that several people can make a big difference if they put their mind to it and work together and cooperate. And this notion that not being involved and letting somebody else do it for you, that's dead. Activism is something that's taking foot all around the country. It's evidenced by movements that have started everywhere, not just with Occupy, but other movements. For example, Mr. Loving's vigil here at the Canadian Embassy. So this notion that government is too big or that corporations are too powerful is just not true. People can make a difference, and that's the big thing that activists need to know. Anybody can be an activist, but you have to learn the information behind which you're interested in changing. You need to know either what it is, the science or the social issue, and then become involved with your community.
Well spoken. Now, I wanted to touch on one thing that we spoke about briefly, that we were talking about different kinds of occupiers, and there are occupiers in the parks and the streets, and you brought up a good point about that you have a full-time day job and yet you're still an occupier. I'd like you to put that in context and just tell us what your views are on that.
Well, yes, it is true that many of the young folks and middle-aged and old folks, many of the folks who are with the movement, with Occupy, are working. Many times we're out in the park and people will come by and just assume that because we're out there that it looks like nothing's going on. They'll say, get a job, but that's just not true. I would say easily half of the people there are working in some type of employment. Myself, I work. Actually, I was holding down 2 jobs while I was during the winter time. Right now, I'm actively with 1. But many people are with nonprofits. Many people are with different endeavors. Some folks are working 2 jobs.
And it takes all of us to do our part. And finally, before we get Mr. Loving on stack and center stage, I was wondering if you could tell us what you think our biggest challenge as a movement is, and what do you suggest as a solution?
Our biggest challenge is trusting each other and not being too scared to step out and learn and communicate with each other. I think there's a lot of paranoia because the authority has come down pretty hard on the Occupy movements. I think occupiers know that this is needless energy wasted. We need to just work together, stay focused on our vision and our goals. And don't worry about what other people are saying or doing. Just continue focusing on what we need to do and do it well. Nobody can be perfect, but everybody can strive for excellence. And when you're working hard on something, learning what it is all about, and then focusing your energy towards your goals, you can't fail. We stand for the truth in what we do. We know that. We're not out here trying to create problems. We're trying to find solutions. And if everybody remembers that, there should be no problem going forward.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that, and it's wonderful to meet you. We've talked a lot on the phone. Have great respect for you, and just so all our audience knows, John's going to assist us in trying to coordinate some other interviews coming out of the D.C. area, so we're really excited about that, and we really appreciate you helping to facilitate this, John. It's been a great pleasure. So if you want to hand off the mic to Mr. Loving,
I will.
We'll get him centered. Thank you for speaking to us, buddy.
Just one more thing. I will be live tweeting this. If anybody wants to follow me on Twitter at John Zengus, my handle, I'll be glad to answer questions which I can or refer them to Mr. Loving, and he'll get back. Okay?
Great. We're putting your Twitter handle up right now.
Great. Thank you.
Hey, friend.
Hey, thank you. Well, it's an honor and a privilege, so just let me know when you're settled in and good to go, and we'll start off. It looks like a beautiful afternoon there in Washington, so hopefully I can hear the birds singing. It's a great backdrop for a discussion about the environment and ecology. So I want to introduce Mr. Loving. His whole name is Start Loving, which I think is just a wonderful admonition. And I was looking around and trying to figure out the best way to describe him, and I decided after a lot of reading and research, the best way to describe him is in his own words. He says, "Start loving. My occupation is your brother. Start loving is our brother." And everything else seems to originate from that position. So welcome, sir. It's an honor and a privilege, and I'm humbled that you're here with us.
Well, thank you, brother. I'm just glad if when Einstein was asked, where did your theory of relativity come from, his answer was, I don't know. It was just there. And what he knew was that he had the theory of relativity. What I know is that I know how to stop environmental Armageddon. Sorry? No, I haven't touched the plug. Can you hear all right?
Yeah, we're good.
Brother?
We're good.
Okay, he says we're good. So what I know is that I didn't see what the answer was to averting climate Armageddon for the next 2,000 generations, and I see it now. So I'm glad to be able to share what I've learned, friend, and you've given me that opportunity.
Okay, well, I want to give just a little brief background because I want to launch into the specific issue you want to discuss. But can you just tell us a brief little bit about yourself, where you came from, and how you came to be an activist?
Well, I was born and raised in one of the wealthiest towns in the world, a suburb of New York City, Short Hills, New Jersey, by a dad who was not born to wealth. His dad was a fireman, a part-time jeweler, just to try and make ends meet. My dad was a gifted teacher of music, but a really gifted teacher of anything. And the most loving person that I've ever met in my life. He thought his devotion should be to his biological family, but I never saw him treat anyone as other than family. He was very stern. He wasn't a kumbaya, cheerful kind of guy, but he was totally devoted to the well-being of people. And not all siblings are drawn to the same things, but I was totally drawn to that. It was a quality of life that I wanted to have. However, I lost the courage of my convictions somewhere through college, and everyone else is about making money and making babies and having families and having houses. So I went and got my MBA at Syracuse in the 77 time frame. Was totally oblivious to the activist. No, not oblivious. I was totally disconnected from the activism of the 60s. I was certainly of age. I could have participated, but a bunch of rabble-rousers and what's this all about. So I should have become educated then, but I wasn't. Went my MBA route, went into the computer industry, and naively thought that computers could be a really great thing for humanity and could help people keep their jobs, and quickly began to see that often companies were folding and people were losing their jobs. I hated the idea of that. So I devoted most of my adulthood to turning around failing organizations, not as a Mitt Romney does, to chop their jobs and take their salaries, but regardless of the personal cost to me, to fight with every breath that I had to be sure that their jobs and salaries weren't lost when I felt that the company was worthy and worthwhile. But by about 13, 14 years ago now, I had enough cumulative evidence to say, you know what, I've succeeded at this in every way that a person can succeed. The money, the successful track record of turning around failing organizations, keeping people's jobs, yada, yada, yada. And this is not where the joyful life is. There's lots of pleasure. There's lots of intoxications that come with all that financial reward. But there's no joy here. And I feel a tremendous sense of responsibility to use my time well and to lead people. We all influence people. We all lead people. And I just was no longer going to lead my life in that direction or anyone else that was looking. I thought I was going to retool as an organizational development guy, consultant, but in a 2-year sabbatical I took when I left my $300,000 a year job as a VP of business development with a $200 million company, guaranteed contract, $500,000 house. I gave myself a 2-year sabbatical, studied all the great thinkers, all the great minds really my focus was joy. Where does joy come from? And not in some new age sense. I studied the great psychologists, religious leaders, sociologists, etc., neurobiologists, any place I could find it. And guess where it comes from? It comes from devoting yourself to what your nervous system thinks is a really important thing for humanity. So pleasure comes from devoting yourself to what your nervous system thinks is good for you and yours. Joy comes from devoting your life to what your nervous system thinks is really good for the tribe or ultimately all of humanity. So I retooled as an elementary school guidance counselor, not an organizational development guy, figuring that this country is really heading off the cliff, and if we're going to make any difference, it's going to be in our young people. Placed myself in one of the largest, neediest elementary schools in the country, south of Philadelphia, Chester, Pennsylvania. Learned, A, that the children were my children just as much as my biological children were, and B, that the only thing that was keeping them alive was the school system. It was their out-of-school experience. So President Obama points to a program in Harlem called the Kids Zone. It's pretty obviously patterned off of what I created by myself in Chester called the 10-20 Zone. In any case, in learning that it was the out-of-school experience, Chester is a 2-mile square city. I suppose it should be called a town, but it's called a city, ringed by 30 miles of disgustingly wealthy suburbs in most cases, with 500 houses of worship. And I thought, okay, I've been networking groups like this my entire life. I'll pull these houses of worship into these children's lives. We have plenty of facilities. Well, that's when I began to learn, and it's been a learning ever since, that in our culture, we don't wish disadvantaged people ill. What we wish is to not have our lives disrupted to help them one tiny bit, and we will fight with everything we have to avoid that. All segments of society. So that was my first hunger strike, to try and pull half a dozen promising pastors I thought I saw over the line. It almost took my life. Family almost literally pulled me off the street, nursed me back to life. I worked in their family business a couple of years, but by then the Darfur genocide was on my radar screen, and as an incredibly overprivileged, selfish young boy, I read the Diary of Anne Frank, and I thought, this should never have been allowed. Everyone should have put their body in the way to stop this. So within a year, I had tied up the ends on this family business I was working in, and have been down here ever since, first keeping my body in the line, in the way of the genocide in Darfur. Turns out that one body alone wasn't enough. And have been on Capitol Hill trying to prevent a needless bombing of Iran several years ago. And when I heard about that we were totally, irrevocably destroying the ability of Earth to support human life 4 years ago, that's been my focus ever since. And frankly, there's no man that I tell what to do, no woman I tell what to do, but collectively, if we lose Earth life support on planet Earth, what else matters, friend? Maybe someone can explain that to me. Exactly. The issues that we claim to care about, it will be another 2,000 generations before we have maybe collected enough discretionary time to be able to talk about them again, unless we stabilize life support now with some pretty simple and seemingly impossible policies. I hope that's what you're looking for. That's my introduction.
No, that was great. It was an astute observation there at the end, and I'm glad you touched on your prior vigils that you had. I had notes that Darfur, and that you were also involved with the protesting against nuclear proliferation for a while. So you are firmly entrenched in the mindset of the D.C. area, and for that we're grateful.
Well, brother, we may get into it, but you could not have said anything more incorrect. There are few people in D.C. That have been as ostracized, as banned, as gleefully marginalized as the fellow that you're talking to in this by every activist in the city religiously for the last 8 years. My mindset is totally different. The issues may look the same, but or may look similar, but I suspect we'll get into it, and I'll let us get into it. But I didn't know it was possible to be as alone as I've been up until some green shoots started to show in Occupy over the last 4 months.
Right.
I didn't know that this alone was possible.
Well, that's an interesting segue. So, are you able to speak to that in context with your current vigil that you're holding, or is that like a separate topic we can talk about later? Because I really want to get into your current vigil.
Yeah, and they can be talked about with either, brother.
Okay. You go right ahead. Roll on. We're all listening.
The central, whereas I've been responsible for multi-million-dollar business situations most of my adulthood, there have been relatively few times that I've had line control over much or all of that. Had I don't believe in using line control. I don't believe in telling people what to do, because all hope lies in harnessing people's hearts.
Can I interrupt for just a second? You need to define line control for us.
Well, sure. So one can imagine that a chief executive officer in a company or a division manager can tell people what to do, correct? Can order people what to do.
Right.
So without line control, one is in the organization, has responsibilities, but does not have direct hire and fire ability over people.
Okay.
Which, again, I'll emphasize, when I've had it, I use it as sparingly as I would use plutonium, because I can't get out of people. No one can get out of people what's needed by telling them what to do. Simply by aligning them with what their heart tells them is worth giving their lives for. And that's that. There is almost no one that understands that. There's almost no one that wants to resist the ability to tell people what to do, and it's frickin' insanity. So that's what I mean by line control.
Very good.
And I was able to achieve business results that were impossible over and over and over again without that line control. And when I had the line control, I didn't use it. But my point is that some so-called unviolent action where you don't violate someone by saying you're not going to have your job anymore, one might think that that can't be practiced in a business environment that's a profit and loss situation, but that's incorrect. And it's what I've been practicing my entire life. There are some people that have known me all that time that are astute enough to realize, okay, Loving, you look different, your causes are different, but what you're doing is no different than what you've been doing your entire life, and that's correct. And the relevance of that is I have 30 to 40 years of experience and study and practice of what I think can only best be termed unviolent warfare. Because when 100 people's jobs are on the line or 1,000 people's jobs are on the line, if you're sane, you go to unviolent war, unless they should lose their jobs, to try and keep their livelihoods going. And if one believes that Citizens United, as I do, is a death knell for democracy in this country, it's the open door for fascism, or if one believes that the 3,500 climate scientists on this planet are not lying to us for the last 15 years, that in fact they believe that we have about 8 years left, a window of about 8 years left to avoid irreversible climate Armageddon, in my opinion, it's a simple matter of sanity. If one isn't warring unviolently, that is mobilizing everything they have, everything they are, to get in the way of that harm, that's not sane. That's just not clinically sane. And I don't consider that a slander. I consider it a diagnosis. One of my advanced degrees is in psychology, and I'm well read in it at the PhD on the few psychologists that are worth studying.
That's outstanding. You speak so eloquently to the issue, and you help frame it. And when you put it into words, you do. It's just fundamental common sense. And, we need to repeat that message over and over. So talk to us about the current VIGIL on CO2 emissions and global warming, where your position is. Tell us about the science of that. I spoke to John earlier, and he was relating some of the history about the documentation and the age of it and how it's now released. So we're working on 7-year-old documentation. I think it would be a good opportunity to educate our viewers on that issue.
Agreed, brother. And I've certainly led us to that, but I want to make a point first that I don't have time to denigrate anyone. The 200 billion people in the next 2,000 generations are the ones that survive, starting with this generation, are going to wonder if they were the lucky ones. They're my family. I don't have time to slander anyone. I don't have time to denigrate anyone. And I don't have time for political correctness. If we don't figure out how to diagnose what's going on here in a way that we can actually mobilize ourselves with the situation, we have the blood on our hands, we have the torture on our hands that Hitler never could have imagined. Never could have imagined doing what our ignorance and apathy and cluelessness is, and cowardice is doing. And to me, none of those words are slander. Any more than a doctor telling me I have cancer is slandering me. They can be disputed. I can dispute the diagnosis, but those are all properly descriptive words. The point that I wanted to make before I go into the science is that the messaging, the situation analysis, the political analysis in this whole area, I don't think that the people leading it on the left are actually paid shills of the fossil fuel industry, that if we win, will be parted from 20, 40, 60, 80 trillion dollars in fossil fuel reserves. I don't think they're paid shills. But if they were, the incompetence, the laying traps for themselves, the can't possibly succeed of the approach, the messaging, the framing is beyond comprehension, and I don't derive any joy in saying that. Here's my point. I've been falling into the trap until recently of talking about this issue in terms of a third to half the world's species being gone by the end of this century, the oceans being dead by the end of this century, half of the rivers and lakes in this country being dead by the end of the century. The fundamental problem that we have, brother, in this country, all of us, and studies bear this out, we have become less human every day for the last 30 years, every year for the last 30 years. The study I have in mind is a study that's done of college students every year to measure their empathy with the best tools available. And every year for the last 30 years, our empathy, our measured empathy of our young people has gone down. Wow, that's really shocking given the quality of the TV that we have and the iPods and everything that separates us. I'm being facetious. But we have become less capable of being connected, our nervous systems connected to the things that really matter. So my point is, the fundamental problem that anyone concerned about the world's issues has is our hearts are on deathbed. And for the people reasonably concerned with what's happening to the environment, which will soon be irreversible, to be framing it in terms of that I just used is to doom ourselves to failure. We don't have enough hearts left to relate to the fact that a third to half the world's species are going to be gone by the end of the century. We should, but we don't. What we might have is enough heart left to care about the impoverishment of our children and grandchildren. So I'm talking about framing, and it's a trivial switch to make. So are you really going to sit by, friend, in the last months that we have to embark on a sane energy policy, knowing that your child's Earth is going to be so impoverished that half of the world's species might be gone by the end of this century? That a third of your children's life is likely to go toward trying to keep a third of the country's wealth, our sea level cities, from going underneath the 6-foot sea level rise that's already there. Are you really okay with the fact that your grandchild will never see a reef in the ocean? I don't know if I'm covering too much, friend, but my point is I just talked about the key ecological issues, but in terms of our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. And unless we can get people's hearts on fire We have no hope here, and we don't have a prayer of getting the populace heart on fire because the seas are going to be dead. We should, but we don't. But maybe the impoverishment of their children.
An excellent point, and no, you speak to anything you want to. This is inspiring and fascinating and startling and disturbing, and I think it's a good message to get out. And I know I want to ask another question. The challenge is, how do we set our hearts on fire, our own and our families and our friends and all the world? How do we do that? It seems, it's such a huge challenge. People, you said that lost the connectivity. I always characterize it as they've become desensitized. We live in a world where it's okay, or it doesn't create any discord for a gentleman such as yourself to have to sit in front of the Canadian Embassy and force the issue by fasting in order to bring the question to the forefront. So how do we, as individuals, as regular people, help to set those hearts on fire?
Well, I several ways you've really in this so far, you've really brought us to the point that I want to go right to, that partly addresses what you said, but I want to go right to it. I'm in the process of finishing a second book. The first one I finished about 3 weeks ago, and I haven't finalized on the title, but it's essentially Awakening the Insanely Humane Warrior in You, a Personal Trainer. And I think the subtitle will be something like the personal characteristics of the unviolent change agents throughout history, and the essential characteristics. Without saying that, I believe that the opening essay, and both books are a series of essays. I believe that the opening essay in this second book will be about the dividing line. I don't know, I can't cite the history of when and how it happened, but I believe that I'm on firm ground. Somewhere between the late 1960s and the late 1970s, a decision among people that consider themselves activists in this country, a decision that probably was unrecognized, not understood, a decision was made. And that decision was let's see now. So the decision made up until the 60s, the civil rights movement, some of the anti-war movement, all that, it was less clear there, was, you know what? There's some stuff that is easily worth my life. You bet your butt I'm getting on that bus. The president's agent has just in terror warned us, we students from Nashville, don't get on that bus. The first buses were just stopped in Mississippi and just barely got out with their lives. And you're getting on buses tomorrow to go back into that? You're going to get people killed. Sir, we signed our last wills last night. We understand perfectly well what we're getting into. Not too long ago, brother, in this discussion, I talked about the isolation that I've had. It's not a complaint. It's not a condemnation of anyone else. But the essence of the central characteristic of the activism that has brought dramatic change to humanity throughout history, the unviolent warfare, I think it's best called, the central characteristic of those people is exactly that they put their bodies in harm's way. They're not suicidal. They're not masochistic. They're not reckless. But they understand, how do I establish to a clinically insane populace that's not giving their daughters the right to vote. Or in Tahrir Square, one of the rare exceptions in the last 40 years, how do I explain to my brothers and sisters in Egypt, how do I show them that, you know what, we can't be human beings if we're treated like children by the most brutal dictator for 30 years now? How do I explain that except by putting my life in the way, thereby making the statement, you know what, there's something more important than my life. And that's what we saw in the women's suffrage movement with Alice Paul and the 200 sisters of hers that subjected themselves to torture in a prison 20 miles south of here in D.C., being force-fed on hunger strike, perfectly happy to die as a statement of what this was worth. Manipulating? No, an expression of what they believed. And brother, when I talked about my isolation, I embody that. To try and convince others, it's not my job to convince others. It's my job to be your brother. And if I see my family in harm's way, my body's going in between. And that is anathema. For the last 40 years, we have decided that for any of our major causes, there is nothing that we will not do to stop the horror that's being unleashed by the corporate world and the right. As long as we can do it from behind our computer screens. As long as it's not going to cost long prison terms. As long as it's not going to get anyone killed. Well, you know what? Women would not be voting today if that had been the decision of the women's suffragists back in 2018. And you know what? We would not have civil rights if that had been the view of the Freedom Riders. So we have totally disarmed ourselves. There are two ways, and two ways only if one looks at history. There are two ways of bringing radical change to an otherwise clinically insane, destructive society. One way is to show up with enough guns that you can convince them, I am going to kill you unless you give me what I want. And the other way is to show up in the perfect and powerful form of unviolent warfare and say, we are not here to cause trouble. We are simply here to collect what is rightfully ours. A seat in that bus terminal in what's called a whites-only waiting room. Or the right of my daughter to vote, who is one of God's children and by every measure should have the right to vote. We are simply here to collect what is rightfully ours, and if the price is our lives, we will happily pay it. Now maybe someone can explain to me that that is not the form of what happened in India. That is not the form of the nonviolence in South Africa. But I've studied this pretty well, and I don't feel clever in saying it. And for the last 40 years, if you want to clear a room of activists, you talk about putting your body in the way and be willing to die until you get what is rightfully yours. You talk about taking personal responsibility, not for acting against it, but for actually stopping it. And if you want to clear a room, you do that. And if you want to be sure you're not talked to again, you do that. We don't take responsibility for fixing it anymore. We do what we want, when we want, what feels good, and then when it doesn't happen, we blame the powers that be. Well, fine, except, friend, we're out of time. If we lose life support on planet Earth, which is a virtual certainty, unless this year or at the latest next year we start reducing emissions 6%. You know, Einstein said 60 years ago, he said, I don't know what weapons World War III is going to be fought with, but I know what the weapons of World War IV are going to be. They're going to be sticks and stones. Well, I know what the weapons of World War III are. Our reckless, needless burning of warming gas emission fuels for the last 30 years. We have 8 times more wind and 200 times more sun in this country than we need to replace every lump of coal, every drop of oil, and it's at grid parity already. But none of us care enough to stand up and put our bodies in the way of the 20 to 80 trillion in fossil fuel reserves that the largest industry on the planet, the fossil fuel industry, will spend every $1 million a day that they have to keep us on the sidelines. That's crazy, man. You know, I wish I had a nickel for everyone that said, Loving, don't die for this. And I'm saying to myself, what? We're about to irrevocably condemn the next 2,000 generations to living hell. And someone would question that I'm willing to die to stop that? What kind of madness is this? What kind of creatures have we turned into? My brothers and sisters all, but I don't get it. I do get that I didn't get it for most of my adulthood, but now that I get it, I don't get it anymore.
That was such a wonderful exposition and a call to action. I don't feel worthy to be conducting this interview. That was so well stated.
My brother, we all do the best we can, but the bottom line is, someone better frickin' figure out for themselves that my assessment of the successful, unviolent warfare, including what we just saw in Tahrir Square a year and a half ago, and I watched I watched and re-uploaded to my YouTube channel, republished every bit of news that was published on that during the whole thing. And these guys were real clear, the Wild Gonims and other leaders. So, guys, you're 3 days into this. Do you think you're going to win? We are not going to win. This guy has a 200,000-man torture force whose job is to kill us, to imprison us, to torture us into submission. We do not expect to win. But we are not going to sit down anymore. And it shocked the conscience of the world. It established, as words never could have, this is worth our lives to stop. And that hacks through our dead, insensitive nervous systems to our almost dead hearts and pulls them enough that we call our governments and we say, you've got to come alongside these guys. You cannot let them be stopped. Is it a surefire? There's no surefire. Is it the strongest weapon known to man? Well, when Gandhi mobilized forces, hundreds and thousands of people who agreed, we are going to march on a salt works that has harvested the salt from our ocean by the British, and they are selling it to us with a tax. That's not okay. That's not right. We're going to show up and we're going to say, we are here to collect what is rightfully ours, the salt from our oceans. We are not here to cause trouble, but we are going to march on this salt works, and if the price is our lives, we will happily pay it. I'm not saying those are the words. I'm saying that's the obvious form of what they did. And they had previously sworn, we're going to be clubbed. We will not raise our hands to block the clubs. We will not raise our hand to protect ourselves. Once the perpetrators, once the folks with the clubs got sufficiently frustrated, when the bodies were on the ground, they would target their groins with their feet, and they would violently kick them in the groins. The protesters refused to cover their groins. This was covered by the New York Times and otherwise. And it was done. It shocked the conscience of the world. Brother, we have disarmed ourselves for the last 40 years of personal responsibility, of a decision. We're not playing to play. We're not playing to feel good. We have selected a cause that is worth our lives. And by God, why the hell wouldn't we why is there nothing that's so important that we wouldn't happily give our lives for it? We have been disarmed for 40 years, and we wonder why we haven't achieved anything except for failure and forming our activist clubs and being nice to each other. And fine, I don't go interfere with people, but it's a circle jerk, and soon, if it's not done, every person that is young or has a child or a grandchild, the ones that survive for the next 2,000 generations are not going to think they were the lucky ones. And if that's not worth your life, and if that's not worth my life, and anyone listening, then someone needs to explain it to me, and more importantly, they need to explain it to the person when they get up in the morning. Because if that's true, we are no longer a viable species, and the horror is we perpetrators, through our cowardly inaction, are not the ones that are going to pay the major price. It's every young person today, and it's every child ever born on Earth. They're the ones that are going to be ground up by our Mother Earth. And God, guys, that's not worth our lives. The bottom line of this campaign, brother, this is EM equals MC squared. I've never understood the formula, but a macrophysicist does, and they can do stuff with it. I never expected to see how to stop environmental Armageddon. And brother, no one has even asked that question. I've done nothing but study this for 4 years. They won't even entertain the question. What can we do? What march can we have? Let's have 4-hour posts and forfeits. But actually say, what do we have to do to stop it? It empties the room. And I can't think about anything else, but I never expected to see the answer. And about 8 weeks ago, it was there when I woke up in the morning. In these two forms. The first part was, I had just seen the documentary, the CBC documentary. It's called Tipping Point. If one Googles Tracking Plan B, the letter B, my blog by that name comes up, and right in the middle of it is a link to an 1.5-hour video that I put up on one of my YouTube sites. It's a CBC documentary. The whole team must have been fired because it was such an expose on the tar sands. It was incredibly heroic and beautifully done. And it showed me two things that I hadn't realized. Canada is expecting, well, actually, I'm going to say it this way, because if we have any listeners here.
Oh, we have plenty. You keep going.
So if we have any listeners, despite studying nothing but this stuff for 4 years, 7 days a week, every waking second, no, not almost every waking second, every waking second, I had no idea of this. So I'm gonna pose a question to you. How much money is Canada expecting to get out of their tar sands? And I'm going to give you just a second to pause and see if you can guess. I had never guessed at the question. I didn't have a clue. Which is a shame to all the thought leaders in this area, because this is just fricking dynamite. It's the whole situation analysis in a nutshell. The answer is Canada is expecting to get between 1.7 and $2 trillion out of the tar sands. Now, people can be driven crazy to the point of murder for $100, for $1,000, for $10,000 in the right situation, right?
Right.
$2 trillion can drive people really, 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 really crazy. Now, the tar sands represent, my rough estimate, 3% of the fossil fuel reserves currently on the planet. If we let any more of those things out of the ground, if we don't start bending it down 6% a year, it's game over. The tundra is going to melt, releasing the thermal equivalent of about 30 million Hiroshima-class nuclear bombs into the atmosphere every day. That's how much warming. An order of magnitude greater than is currently up there, warming in a degree and a half. It's game over. But for $1.5 trillion, see, the other thing the Tipping Point showed, some of you guys know the name James Cameron. He was the money and the brains behind the movie Avatar and others.
Right.
James Cameron had a cameo in this, and I think is trying to republish it in the States because it's so powerful. Whether it was their purpose or not, I don't know, but it centered around a town on Lake Athabasca, which is right on the tributary, the river that is fed from the upstream tar sands works. The cancer rates are 4 or 5 times the national population for cancer rates. And during the course of this, you see the family doctor seeing that the town doctors, seeing that with the national healthcare system, seeing that the cancer rates are going up dramatically, beginning to appropriately, this is a mild-mannered man, feed this information back to the national healthcare system. The national healthcare sends in a team They literally go over to the faucet, grab a mug of water, drink a mug of water, and say, "You don't have a problem," and the family doctor gets fired. This is gross insanity. This is gross inhumanity. I don't know if you're understanding based on my synopsis. This documentary is an absolute must-see. It's not some nasty Michael Moore expose. It's very professionally done, but the insanity that $1.7 trillion in expected revenue can drive people to, and I had never heard anyone talk about the financial value of the fossil reserves that are at issue here. My rough estimate is $40 trillion. How hard do we think that the coal and gas industry is going to fight any sane legislation? Do we really think that anything less than enough people seen dying for it is going to wake up enough of our fellow citizens to say, what's going on here? To cut through the $1 million plus a day that's being spent to keep us on the sidelines? Do we really think that anything less than 1,000 people showing up in front of the Canadian Embassy saying, we're simply here to collect what's rightfully ours? You pay the wreckage costs on your fuel, right? So the wreckage costs have been easily calculated. If I spend $1 on gasoline, the wreckage costs are $4 in terms of fortifying our cities, for example, against the sea level rise. Mm-hmm. Are we really going to let New York City go under 6 feet of water? We're not. Our children are going to spend all of their discretionary income on trying to pay to fortify it and the rest of our cities. So the demand here is not to stop tar sands, is not to stop coal, is not to stop oil. It is you pay your wreckage costs. If you smoke today, your health care costs are going to be huge. I don't want you to smoke. I don't want you to die. I don't have the right to tell you not to smoke. I do have the right to tell you I'm not paying your health care costs. You're going to. And that has two effects. It takes your health care costs off of me, and it increases by $2 to $3 a pack your cost of cigarettes. And guess what? Your use of cigarettes goes down. Mm-hmm. So the demand here, which was not figured out by me, it was figured out by a team of economists, and it's best expressed by Jim Hansen, the only hero here, the NASA scientist, who's been the leading edge on the science here. He's now proposing what's called fee and dividend. Every year, we will simply begin to add the wreckage fee so it's paid by the consumers of coal and tar sands and oil instead of plug-in hybrids and wind and solar energy. That's the demand here. You pay your wreckage costs. Now, when that legislation is announced, guess what just happened to the value of the tar sands? It went down by 75%. Guess what just happened to the value of a new coal-fired power plant? It just went down the toilet. It makes no sense to do that when today wind power, your coal-fired electricity, and that's probably what you're getting in North Carolina, is about 7 cents a kilowatt hour. Guess what wind generated electricity coming out of that same wall socket would cost you? About 7 cents a kilowatt hour. But we are so lethargic, honey, I don't have time to worry about where our energy is coming from. But the second that this legislation is announced, where over 10 years, the real cost, including the 4 times wreckage cost of your coal and oil and tar sands, are going to start coming on your bill. Honey, you remember that little box on our energy bill where we could check to get wind-powered electricity instead of coal-powered electricity? I think we ought to check that box. You remember the new car we were going to buy, honey? 10 years from now, oil's going to be, our gas is going to be $15 a gallon. And I just read that today a plug-in hybrid running off of wind power is the equivalent of $1 a gallon at gasoline. Honey, I think we're going to get a plug-in hybrid this time. So we just killed the whole Earth-killing meteor. Now, the insanity of my brothers and sisters in the environmental movement is, what are they trying to kill? The tar sands, the Keystone Pipeline. That has all the sanity as if you and I saw that there was an Earth-killing meteor hurtling toward Earth that was going to destroy all life on Earth, and you and I had the bright idea, well, it'd be awfully hard to stop the whole meteor. Let's destroy 3% of it. Kind of insane, wouldn't it be?
Yep, it's a really, really good point, and it's one we talk about frequently, is the ability to address the root causes. The root causes.
We don't have any. Mother Nature is going to say, you guys can keep playing if you want, but you know what, guys? You don't have the time clock here. I do. You've got 8 years to reduce your emissions of global warming emissions by the year 2020, a minimum of 50%, and the estimates I trust the most still say 80%. So we can achieve that if we reduce our emissions between 6 and 8% per year, starting in 2012 and at the latest 2013. And there is not anyone that I know on the stage that is talking about doing that. They're talking about the need to do it, but if you try and engage them in a discussion of, okay, all right, I believe what you're saying, how are we going to do it? You just emptied the room.
Right.
Well, I'm standing alone with some support from my brothers and sisters in Occupy, but so far I'm standing alone. And I expect to finish my part of this alone. I expect to blaze this trail. I expect to no longer be alive 4 weeks from now. I'm not married to that. What I'm married to is that this is going to end on my watch. And what I'm married to is that what will stop it is 1,000 people showing up here in front of the Canadian Embassy and saying, we will happily die here until we get the... And by the way, the Canadian Embassy is just a good backdrop. This is U.S. policy that we're going for.
Right.
Adding the wreckage cost to our coal that comes out of the mine, our oil that comes out of the ground, our oil that comes into a port, our products that come into a port. So this is a national policy. Canadian Embassy, however, is a great backdrop. I'm going to do my part. If someone shows me a better way, I'll do that. But there isn't a better way. This is the way. I can't make 1,000 people show up, but I can blaze the trail. And maybe it will cause some others to think, do I really? If there are 1,000 people in this country that love humanity more than they love their own life, they will come here, they will join this, whether or not I'm still alive, and most of them will not be allowed to die until it shocks the conscience of this country, and they say, this is fricking insane. Wind and sun are the same price as coal and oil, and I'm allowing this to be a social welfare state for our coal and oil companies to destroy my children's future? No, this is crazy. I want this legislation. 1,000 people wouldn't be allowed to die. I'm going to blaze that trail. What kind of a human being would I be not to do that?
It's something that should be celebrated. Your generosity of your sacrifice for your cause. I have 2 questions that I'm hesitant to ask. If you don't care to answer them, that would be fine.
Go for it, man. Go.
Where do you find the strength of your commitment? What is the source of the strength of your commitment?
It's a great question, brother, and I am as an obvious student of nonviolent actions that have had any import throughout history. I believe that I'm speaking for any successful movement there's ever been. I wish I had a nickel for every time someone has said to me, I really appreciate your standing up for your cause. You can't do this standing up for a cause. Gandhi spoke of, people would say, Gandhi, what is the power you're trying to tap into? What is satyagraha? What is truth force? What is soul force? And there were very few times that he was really pushed long enough to get to the root of it. But if you study his writings in detail, as I have, you can finally find places where he's pushed to the ground and he says, okay, what I'm talking about is the love of a mother for her child. And a healthy mother will sacrifice her life for her child? She doesn't think of it as sacrifice. She will happily give her life for the life of her child, right?
Right.
The only place that this strength can come from is the connection of one human heart to other human hearts. So we can understand that a mother would sacrifice, would allow herself to perish so that her child could have a life, correct?
Correct.
The studies are clear. There is no hard wiring that has anything to do with biological relation. A Gandhi and a king simply had the kind of heart that we were all born to have. Everyone was their family. Everyone was their brother. Every life they experienced as part of their own. Another person's joy was their joy. Another person's pain was their joy, was their pain. The inhumanity of the vile racists in the civil rights movement was the pain of Dr. King and the co-workers. So I have developed devices. I am in the final the final days of writing a book to try and help others that want to do what I've done, which is to reshape myself into the kind of human being that I wanted to be. Gandhi's famously said, "Be the change you want to see in the world." You know, I don't know that he ever elaborated that, but if someone said to you, "Be the person that could climb Mount Everest," that probably wouldn't conjure in your mind that you were going to sit down for an afternoon and think what that meant. What you were going to do was set yourself to a 6, 8, 10, 12-month regimen or longer of creating yourself into someone that could climb and survive climbing Mount Everest, correct?
Correct.
We know by now that, I don't know what the percentage is, but let's say 50% of being a world-class activist is work in the mind. It's reshaping the nervous system. It's focused learning. It's focused imagery. Well, this second book is to put in words my answer to your question of how does one return to sanity. And I'm happy to throw out that challenge. Anyone that thinks it's insane, that I would joyfully be saying, I am happy to pay my life to stand in the way of Armageddon for the next 2,000 generations. To me, that's a classic, that's the perfect test of sanity. Those that say I'm insane, I have nothing to say to you, brothers and sisters. Those that would say, wait a minute, is he the one that's insane? Or am I the one that's insane? Why the hell wouldn't that be worth my life? 200 billion people? To me, that's it, brother. That's what it comes down to. And I'm writing a book so I had those inclinations since I was a young child because I saw it in my father, and through that I saw it in the man, not the deity, but the man, Jesus. But seeing it and seeing the inclinations and clawing my way back to it in being in the most selfish, greedy, cowardly country that we've ever had. If Pearl Harbor happened today, I don't know that we'd stand up and put on uniforms and fight it. I think we'd talk about it for the next 5 years until there were German flags over the country. That's how dehumanized we've become. So having the inclination was one thing. Setting my mind to becoming that person was a daily regimen, is a daily regimen. And in the book, which should be on both of my websites, just Google Start Loving or Google Tracking Plan B, it'll take you to those sites right to the top. You'll see a link to my first book, which I highly recommend, Global Warming's Death, Fast, which is all about the strategy, the ecology, the messaging, the unviolent warfare strategy of this death fast, this death strike. And the second one on reclaiming the humanity of the Freedom Riders, of the Tahrir Square people. And if you don't think that's humanity, if you don't want the joy and the heart and the human connection of that, don't waste your time. But if you have the inclinations that I do, that I wanted to be that kind of person, I'll tell you, friends, I wish I could point you to other books that could get you there, but those can.
There's such I just wrote a comment that said, I think this whole evening has been uplifting, astonishing, and challenging, and I view it as listening to you and watching you express yourself as a call to action. You know, it plants the questions in my mind. Okay, I get it. You know, what can I do? What, you know, I really appreciate what you're saying and how you're presenting it, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to have had the conversation. I have one more question,
and I'm grateful back at you. I hope what I've shared and how I've shared it has been appropriate to your format.
Oh, absolutely.
But I'm certainly grateful for the opportunity to share what you've let me share.
My next question, it sort of revolves around, you spoke a few minutes ago that you would guess you have about 4 weeks left to continue your vigil, and you're willing to, as you didn't characterize it so much as sacrifice, but as a willingness to give yourself over to something bigger, which I have enormous amount of respect for. What could happen in that 4 weeks to enable you to break this fast? In 4 weeks, what could change that would enable you to break your fast?
If someone Googles tracking Plan B, those 3 words, the letter B, I have a brief clip that auto plays when someone gets to the site, and it's a brief clip from the movie Apollo 13. It is the scene where they've figured out that life support just blew out on that capsule. They've just done some calculations of how it's going to wind up, and how it's going to wind up is that the capsule, which is on one side of the moon, is going to slingshot around the moon, and it's going to make it about a quarter of the way back, and then the guys are going to die. And the room full of engineers go into arguments and discussions, and the mission control guy in a couple of seconds cuts through it with a knife and says, "Whoa, guys, we're not here to talk about this. Currently, you've told me how to get these guys a quarter of the way back. We're not going to talk about how to get them a quarter of the way back. We're going to talk about how we're going to get them back, and the next time you come into this room, you're going to tell me how. You're not going to tell me what the problems are. You're going to tell me how." Brother, our adversaries, I think it's not inappropriate to call them that, the corporations, the brothers and sisters on the right that are insane with the thought of $40 trillion in fossil fuel reserves. These guys don't play, brother. People in business don't play. They may play for the wrong reasons, but they don't play. They put their lives on the line. They're working 14, 15, 16 hours a day when there's a crisis in their business. NASA wasn't a business, but it was the same kind of mentality. Really, the mentality I've got is like, oh my gosh, this is so strange in the activist community. But you know what? It's not strange in your opposition. These are people that one way or another put their bodies on the line. All of this is framing the answer to your question, brother. Like any good warrior, violent or unviolent, and if we're not warriors, if we're not waging everything we have and everything we are, we're irrelevant, because the opposition is not playing games here. Tell me your question once again.
I want to know what can happen.
Yes, what would I do? Right.
Weeks.
So the only thing that an unviolent warrior worth the name is inflexible on is the outcome. The only thing that mission control guy was inflexible on was the outcome. We are going to get them down. I don't care what you tell me we have to do to get them down. We are going to get them down. I don't care how we are going to get the policy that reduces emissions 6 to 8% per year starting this year. I don't care how we do that. But that we're going to do it, that I'm inflexible on. So, if, and these are hypothetical almost to the point of being ridiculous, if President Obama and Stephen Chu showed up here or brought me to their offices and said, listen, Loving, due to politics and whatnot, there's an awful lot we couldn't tell you, but you know we've been spending boatloads of money on R&D. And no one knows about this stuff, but we're going to tell you. And we're about to release some new technologies that are going to do what you wanted legislation to do. Now, I've done nothing but study this for years, and my life long I've been in politics. I think I'm the only one on the planet that understands Obama really well because I'm the same kind of leader he was, the same kind of analyst he was. That's not the case. We do not have a technological slam dunk to this. A second one, however, would be there are three people who have spent much longer than I in digesting the science of this. James Hansen, who is the most respectable guy on the scene by far, the NASA scientist who several times risked his career in the Bush administration and continues to be the leading edge on this. If James Hansen, Joseph Romm, who is the world's premier blogger on this, he's an MIT scientist, has been at it for years, was the #2 guy in the energy department for the Clinton administration, a policy wonk and a technology wonk. If those two plus Lester Brown, author of Plan B 3.0, that is the book, by the way. Anyone that, besides reading my 2 books, which are free, by the way, I'm your brother, I don't sell stuff, I provide what I can to help. You're fools if you care about this issue and you don't read my 2 books. And if you don't read Plan B 3.0, which is also available online, you don't care about this issue. Every other book is a henny penny, good information, but this one provides the roadmap out of here. He's written 2 since, they're watered down, don't waste your time with them. Plan B 3.0, available free online. If those 3 people, who are the 3 that have my respect on the science and the technology, if all 3 of them communicated to me, Loving, you've got the science wrong, or you've got the time frames wrong, I would listen. You might expect that I would say, I would accede to what they said. That's not the case. I would listen. Because all 3 of them, who have my respect on the science end, are very much a product of the last 40 years. That we, not being in uniform, not being soldiers, would think of putting our lives on the line for anything is incomprehensible to us. And these 3, I'm not denigrating them here, have been losing this battle for so many decades. They don't even know how to ask the question of themselves anymore, how do we win this? But I would listen if they came and they said, all 3 of them, Loving, you have the time frames wrong or you have the science wrong. Now, I've read all their works many times, so I don't have what they've written wrong, but I still would be willing to hear from them. The third, and slightly more likely, several days ago, the brightest hope I've seen of a true activist in my 8 years here in D.C. Almost everyone else I've seen, aside from a few green shoots in Occupy, have been heartbreakingly not activists, faux activists. We'll do whatever it takes, as long as it's not going to cost us anything. My brothers and sisters all came to me several days ago and said, I'm joining this death fast. But I don't think now is the time. You've gotten this on the radar screen. There was an LA Times article. This is now a known commodity. You've said, rightly, that this will stop when there are 1,000 people here dying to stop it. What's the fastest way to get those 1,000? Is it for you to die now? Or for you to move off of this and we spend the next 6 months communicating every way we can to people around the country to get them to come and join something that might begin in early November or mid-November. I don't know if that's going to materialize. If it did, if people came to the fore that were on fire about this, on fire about making that happen, then I have a decision to make. Do I allow my life to terminate now, or do I spend the next 6 months and then restart in November? If people that are on fire emerge, then I have a choice. What's more likely to emerge is people that, God love them, love me, and don't want me to die, not in deceit, but will have fooled themselves that, oh no, we'll work with you. I'm real good at seeing the fire. And if I see people on fire for the campaign, then I've got a choice to make. If I see my people on fire to keep me alive, I don't have a choice to make. It's time for us to get from 1,000 down to 999. That's the answer.
And as in the other answers you've given, that's very clear and concise, and just, it's startling, but it does frame the issue in a perspective that we all can understand and respond to.
Brother, maybe to my, Gandhi said of himself, and I don't think he was a liar, I don't think he said things just to say it, he would go on at great length about how ashamed he was of himself as a child. I don't know that he used the word ashamed, but he was just in agony of what a coward he was. I'm not unlike that. Had anyone told me that I would be the person I am right now 15 years ago, I might have driven into a bridge abutment in terror. But my real point here is, maybe to my shame, there is nothing that I've said tonight, there's nothing I've written in those books, there's nothing I've said in years that I figured out to tell someone else. Everything I've shared, everything I know of relevance, I've had to figure out to climb myself out of the matrix, to climb myself out of the inhumanity that we're turned into with this culture back to a human being. But like Gandhi and like King, who were explicit that they didn't think there was anything unusual about their nervous systems, I don't think there's anything unusual about my nervous system. And the same rungs that I've figured out and carved out to climb out of the matrix are there for anyone else to use that wants to climb out of the matrix. So if I make sense, it's because I had to make sense to me first, because otherwise I'm paralyzed. I mean, I didn't wake up and think, gee, I want to go on death fast. Gee, I'd really like to die, because you know what? I don't want to die. I want to stop the genocide that we are funding our Israeli lunatic right-wing brothers and sisters to do to our brothers and sisters in Palestine. There are 20 million AIDS refugees. I'd love to have 20 million lives to give to them. I'd like to be around. But if we don't stop the final destruction of life support on planet Earth, the release of the thermal equivalent of 30 million Hiroshima-class nuclear bombs going off in the atmosphere every day because we let the tundra mass melt, and it may be too late to stop that already, the issues we want to talk about won't be discussed for another 2,000 generations. Not on my watch. Failure's not an option. So if anyone listening might love humanity more than they love their own life, you read the 2 books I've put up there. You'll find my email address on my site. You get in contact with me, and you either tell me why I'm incorrect, or you tell me when you're going to arrive to join. And if enough of you show up fast enough, it It won't prevent my extinguishing, but most of you won't be able to allow to die, and we will win this thing.
Mr. Loving, thank you so much. It's been
thank you,
an
brother.
honor and a privilege. I am
back at you,
and I wish you well in your vigil, and we take your words to heart, and you have given us a lot to think about, and you have educated us in depth. Thank you so much for sharing your evening with us.
I'm very grateful for the opportunity you've given, brother. Be well.
I will too. And if John is still there, give him our best. And if Keith is still there with you, tell him to have a safe ride home. And you take good care and know you're in our thoughts, sir. Thank you very much.
Be well, brother. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.